This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Shane, a lot of stories. Obviously, we could spend an awful lot of time talking again about the impeachment hearings, but hey, I don't think anything new really happened there, as we said last week. But obviously the story of the week, and especially for people of faith, had to do again with Chick-Fil-A. I mean, first of all, there's something to say about how deeply embedded Chick-Fil-A is in the lives of so many of us. I mean, calls for boycotts this week, all kinds of things. I don't know about your kids. My kids put in their vote, and they're definitely not for a boycott.
Yeah, my kids ask for Chick-fil-A on a routine basis, and even yesterday, my wife and my mom met up, and they were going to meet at Chick-fil-A, and then they ended up meeting at Zaxby's because my wife had misgivings after all of the stuff that's happened. So, yeah, it's going to be a lifestyle change if you decide to stop going to Chick-fil-A.
I was at the Minneapolis airport yesterday. I tweeted this out that, you know, if the line at that airport, and especially, it's always funny when you walk by Chick-fil-A in an airport, the airports that allow them. You know, I never eat Chick-fil-A when I fly, and it's not because I don't want to. It's because the lines are too long, and that hadn't changed yesterday, at least in Minneapolis. If the line's there, any indication they're going to weather this storm. But let's talk about what this storm is, because there's a lot of detail here behind it. And this is, I think, the first point of this part of our conversation, is that the media headlines over-reported what Chick-fil-A actually announced. So Chick-fil-A put out an announcement this week on Monday about its charitable giving, saying that it was refocusing its priorities on education, on homelessness, and on feeding the hungry. And that was really what it said. And within minutes, most of the mainstream media, so-called mainstream media headlines, reported it quite differently. I mean, their headline of the press release was Chick-fil-A to refocus its priorities or something like that. You know, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, their headlines were very different. Chick-fil-A to stop giving to anti-LGBT groups, Chick-fil-A to stop giving to groups that oppose same-sex marriage, Chick-fil-A to stop giving to Christian groups or faith-based groups. None of that necessarily was true, and there's so many kind of nuances here. Obviously, Chick-fil-A has kind of weathered a culture war battle really since 2012 to grow into the third largest fast food restaurant on the planet. In 2012, Chick-fil-A CEO Dan Cathy, who is the son of Truett Cathy, the founder of Chick-fil-A, known for being a Christian company, or at least founded by Christians, closed on Sundays, so families, and did it from the very beginning of the restaurant. Dan Cathy, in an interview, said that he could not support same-sex marriage. That led to all kinds of outrage and hysteria that's continued. Now, Chick-fil-A corporately decided that they weren't going to talk about this anymore. They haven't talked about it since 2012, so we're talking about 7 years of silence on it. And yet, the reputation that Chick-fil-A has had for being a hate group, for being a hate-based company. Shane, you'll not believe this, but on Saturday, I was in California for the live action gala. Our friend Lila Rose celebrating three pro-life heroes, Benjamin Watson, Ben Shapiro, and Gianna Jessen. It was just a wonderful evening. And one of my friends who was at the event as well does some teaching over at Pepperdine in the business school. And he was mentoring three young business students and talking about this idea of, you know, basically applying your deeply held beliefs to your work. And she said, and specifically in investing, so, you know, it's cause-based investing, there's other phrases for it. But his student, it was a girl, said, I want to know how I can, what did she say, avoid any connection with Chick-fil-A. I don't want to, you know, oppose Chick-fil-A because they're anti-woman. I mean, of all the reputations that Chick-fil-A has gotten, I was like, where did she get that idea? He had no idea. She had no idea. And it was a great talking point. So this was just Saturday, and then Monday the announcement comes out. But Chick-fil-A's dealt with this reputation for a long time. At the same time, it became clear that Chick-fil-A, even though it didn't say any of the things in the announcement that the headline said, was going to separate from organizations like the Salvation Army, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and there was another group too, a smaller charity, of course, none of which are culture war organizations. But this is the source of the hate since 2012, the only kind of smoking gun that pro-LGBT forces could find is that they give to organizations that don't fully endorse the LGBT quote unquote agenda. Now, when you think of Salvation Army and you think of Fellowship of Christian Athletes, you don't think of hate groups, right? I mean, these guys are pretty standard. And the other thing that sat wrong with a lot of folks was the refocusing of priorities on homelessness and feeding the hungry, but separating giving from the Salvation Army, which is one of the largest groups dealing with those two issues. So there was just a lot of concern, and that's just the first round of details, but I'll stop there, Shane. When you heard that and saw the headlines, what did you think?
I think watching the back and forth on social media, there are some myths that have sort of emerged that need to be dispelled. Like you said there, Chick-fil-A's legend has been larger than life for so many people. You know, they've not tried to take an active role in the culture wars since at least 2012. And in fact, they've pretty much laid low. But the myth has just grown and grown and grown. I mean, from the way a lot of progressive media outlets talk about Chick-fil-A, you'd think they make their employees wear red robes with big white bonnets and, march them down to the birthing farms.
And yet another Handmaid's Tale reference. Oh my goodness.
It just keeps coming. And the color theme is right too, red and white. But yeah, it's really not fair. But on the other side of the coin, I saw a lot of conservatives kind of trying to deny what's obviously happening, saying, oh, the media is snookering us. They're blowing this up out of proportion. They're making it into something it's not. Chick-fil-A is just reshuffling their giving priorities. And I would see this corporate jargon sort of repeated over and over again. But like you said, John, you don't stop giving to the Salvation Army and then say, we did that so we could focus more on homelessness. I mean, nobody does it better than the Salvation Army, in historical terms. This was, I think, calculated to try to walk a tightrope between the conservative base on the one side, who really appreciates Chick-fil-A's Christian roots, and on the other side, the politically correct mob, for lack of a better, I don't think there is a better term, who's been applying endless pressure on Chick-fil-A to revise their principles on this and to cave to LGBT ideology. I mean, the timing on this is key. Chick-fil-A in just the last year, John, has been shut out of a number of key markets, including the UK, precisely because of this pressure for them to conform and to stop giving to, organizations that define marriages between a man and a woman. So it's hard to see this as anything but Chick-fil-A trying to step out of the culture wars and trying to, strike a more mediating position on this issue, right?
Yeah, it is. But there's even pieces there that we've got to continue to separate. And that's what I think is so helpful, Shane, about what you said, is that clearly the headlines on the left have overblown the story on Chick-fil-A for years. And on the right, this idea Chick-fil-A won't give to Christians anymore. I mean, none of that's true either. And then there's also the divide, too. You've got owner-operators who, look, if you've ever met an owner-operator, if you run a local pregnancy care center or a local Christian school or a local nonprofit or do a local kind of charitable effort, your best allies are Chick-fil-A owner-operators. I mean, these are some of the best people on the planet. The screening process to get a Chick-fil-A franchise is like unbelievable. And you've got to fall into the nicest person on the planet category. And so this doesn't implicate them at all. And, so that's why calls for boycotting, we'll get back to that in just a second, didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, just because on the ground, I don't think that the generosity or the priorities of owner-operators have changed one bit. There's also the family, the founding family, which, have been remarkable forces for good in their giving and have often given, corporately. But there certainly is a difference between corporate giving and personal giving. I don't think the Cathy family's faith here is implicated either. This was a decision made, in corporate. And I do think you're right, where this isn't an abandonment of necessarily the faith, but it is an attempt to walk a tightrope. And it's an attempt that doesn't work. And, we talked about this on a Breakpoint commentary earlier this week, that, look, no one should think that everybody has to get involved in every culture war battle. And I fully understand the pressure, particularly for a chicken restaurant, to try to back away slowly. Right. The problem is, I'm not sure we're going to get that choice to back away slowly or to sit this one out, especially when you already have that reputation. And I think a reputation that's undeserving in some senses, but because you've kind of been very clear, this is what we value. The corporate mission statement has been very clear for Chick-fil-A. It's really been such an impressive restaurant and how they manage their people, even how they set up the franchise arrangements, from top to bottom.
I mean, we don't always pick our roles in the culture wars, John. And this is something that I think a lot of people realize about Chick-fil-A, and I've seen articulated over and over again by guys like Tony Perkins in the last few days. This isn't just a chicken restaurant, in one sense of the issue. And they've got every right to control their giving, but I've seen this mentality that, conservatives just need to pipe down and chill out. It's a fast food joint. And here's why I think that's mistaken. Chick-fil-A has been more than a restaurant for a lot of people for a long time now. For a large subset of American evangelicals, conservatives, they've been kind of living proof that it's possible to succeed in the business world while still, holding on to your convictions. Rod Dreher talked a little bit about this. He told the story of just a couple of days ago walking into a pastor's secretary, her office, and he had to break the news about Chick-fil-A to her. She hadn't heard. And he says he could just see the discouragement on her face. Her eyes
Shane, that happened
fell.
to me literally last night. I was speaking with a group, and I made a joke, and the room laughed, and one guy was like, What? I love Chick-fil-A.
What happened to Chick-fil-A? Yeah.
And I talked to him, his face just fell. I mean, it plays a role, and it's more than just good food and good service and, great mentoring for young workers. They really have tried to be Christian through and through and been pretty successful at it. So you're right. It is kind of
and it was a quiet resistance. It was an act of resistance to go and buy a chicken sandwich. It didn't make that much of a difference in the grand scheme of things, but it felt good to say, there's a business out there
good too.
That's yes, it tastes so delicious. Yeah, it felt good to say there's a business out there that's making it, and they're not giving up on their principles. And as Rod Dreher asked, what's a smaller business owner supposed to make of this when he or she is trying to hold on to their principles and yet still succeed in the business world? Well, the only message they get from this is, well, if Chick-fil-A can't stand up, if they can't hold against the pressure, then how can I?
Yeah, and Shane, I think it's important that we not underestimate the pressure. And you and I have talked about this, and Rod Dreher has, I think, been such a clear articulator of, look, the pressure now, this isn't the same culture we lived in 15 years ago. Things that were fully acceptable for a Democratic candidate for president to embrace, like the traditional definition of marriage, put you in the same category as some of the great hate groups in history now. And I don't want to underestimate the pressure that the organization felt and what they were trying to respond to. And yet at the same time, this will hurt their bottom line more than anything Dan Cathy said in 2012. We got more to talk about. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week with John Stonestreet and Shane Morris. We're talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
We invite you to visit breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources. And you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Back on Breakpoint This Week, John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. We're talking about the stories of the week and what else? Chick-fil-A. And, I think a lot of Christians are trying to think their way through it, and I hope we all do think our way through it. It's interesting that just providing a good product, providing great service, doing it now for 7 years without kind of wading into the battles, being generous with your money to groups that are doing really good work, means you can't sit out the battles of our culture, as you were saying right before the break. And the other thing I want to bring up on this, Shane, which is the other thing that caused a lot of us concern, is having played that role in culture, like it or not, they just have. This idea that there is a way to thread the needle on particularly opposite sides of the sexual issues in our culture. The idea that you can back out. I predicted this right off the bat, as did many others, both on social media this week as well as on the Breakpoint commentary, which we'll link to at breakpoint.org, that, look, you won't be able to appease folks who now have taken the role of bully. And I had people on social media say, don't call them bullies, that say, well, I know Jack Phillips. And because I know Jack Phillips and what he's been through for 7 years, he's been bullied for 7 years. And immediately what we saw is, well, I don't care if you have stopped giving to the Salvation Army and the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, those hate groups. And let me just back up again and say, that's where we're at as a culture. We're the bell ringers at Christmas time, right? They're the hate group. Come on. None of them have been involved in the culture war ever. Salvation Army put out a statement almost immediately saying, look, we probably help more LGBT homeless youth than any other organization in America, which is probably true. But because they're not taking a progressive stance, a fully affirming stance, then they're a hate group. And of course, I think it was GLAAD that it immediately issued a statement saying this isn't enough, not until you start donating to one of us. And then there was an article on CNN, and we'll link to this too. It was amazing, basically saying, don't trust Chick-fil-A. They're still a hate group. You know, I mean, it's like, look, you won't be able to be woke enough. You know, Martina Navratilova and apparently Ellen DeGeneres aren't woke enough. Chick-fil-A doesn't have a chance to be woke enough. And they're not going to be able to appease, you know, short of dropping the uniform and putting on changing all the uniforms to rainbow. And I think that's something that we've got to know as well. I don't think we can toe the line on this one.
Yeah, the self-flagellation that Chick-fil-A is expected to perform will know no end. This is a lesson I can't believe so many people on the conservative side of the so-called culture war have failed to learn. But if the other side is not going to be appeased by simple gestures of neutrality. They don't want neutrality. They want unconditional support. And, part of prosecuting this culture war for them has been destroying those who are stained with having taken the wrong side for too long, or even stained with the reputation of having taken the wrong side for too long. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the program, Chick-fil-A has just been slammed year after year after year in the press as some sort of virulent hate group when they've actively tried to stay out of this stuff, at least in terms of, public statements and so forth. And now they've altered their giving to try to bring that into conformity. But like you said, the first thing we heard, it's not enough. They need to do more. They need to do better penance. Here's how you earn forgiveness, Chick-fil-A. You got to go and give to this and that LGBT organization, and then come back after that and we'll talk about maybe forgiving you. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Okay. What's interesting that another story of the week almost gives us a glance, 5 or so years, 10 years, and maybe longer into the future. We've spoken a lot on the program about the Boy Scouts specifically and their precipitous decline from what they once were. And it's interesting because that's another beloved institution in American culture. At least it has been, certainly much more than it is now. And it's a dying organization by all indications. The numbers have just plummeted. It's been plummeting for quite a long time, and I think that reflects a lot of what's happening in the culture. But specifically, since the decision to no longer be the Boy Scouts and all kinds of other decisions that they've made. Well, a big news of just the trouble. Their flagship property, which is called the Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico, the Boy Scouts announcing this week that they're going to mortgage that property. Which means financially, they're in big trouble. I mean, hundreds of thousands of Boy Scouts have spent weeks upon weeks upon weeks learning the skills that the Boy Scouts have historically taught there at the Philmont Scout Ranch. It's an incredible property. Our former colleague, Warren Smith, has spent a lot of time out there. You could tell, when we were communicating with him this week, this was kind of like a gut punch for him, given, just the importance of that property. That's a tough one to see on a number of levels, but it does tell us that. We were talking about this week, Shane. We were talking about how, look, Target took a lane and a side on this right off the bat, and they're fine. Chick-fil-A took a lane on this right off the bat, whether they wanted to or not, and they've been fine up, at least up until this point. We'll see what happens. But when you're in a lane and you shift lanes, it's going to be really hard because you're not going to please either side. And I think that's at least part of the story of the Boy Scouts.
Yeah, you're in big trouble when you try to shift over and change your identity mid-stride, especially in the midst of an already serious decline. Because the Boy Scouts, I think it was 2013, they changed the policy to allow gay members and troop leaders, and that was a major identity shift for them. And I know it was a boon for kind of alternative organizations like Trail Life USA, which I've heard a lot of good things about. But the sentiment that sort of emerged in our discussion this week was that much like Chick-fil-A, perhaps, the Boy Scouts are an organization that is forgetting who they are or forgetting who they have long been perceived to be. Unquestionably, some of the decline they've experienced in recent decades has been the result of what I think Robert Putnam calls bowling alone. America has just become disjointed and disassociated as a society. We're individualistic to a fault. But something else has happened in the Scouts in recent years. According to the World Report I read by our friend Warren Cole Smith, the Boy Scouts lost about 16% of their membership just since 2012, just since that announcement, when they allowed gay scouts and troop leaders. And the decline has just accelerated since then, as best I can tell. And much of that, I think, is because it's kids and families who would normally gravitate toward it for the values that are taught there, the life lessons, the lifestyle that's taught by the Boy Scouts. And they're sort of repulsed by this attempt to become woke. I think rightfully so. So yeah, this is the latest blow for the Scouts. And like you said, I don't think it's too much prognostication to say this is a death knell for the organization. I mean, this is a property that goes back almost a century, near to the founding of the Boy Scouts.
It does. And, I'm grateful for my friends at Trail Life USA. We've, talked about the role that they're trying to play in kind of bringing an option to families who have benefited from the Boy Scouts. Having a son, I get it. We had this conversation in our home, and I talked to even my girls. When boys have older sisters, I grew up that way, right? I mean, sisters treat, little babies as their own real life personal dolls. And one of the things I just stressed with them, I said, look, he's a boy. We're going to talk to him like he's a boy. We're going to treat him like he's a boy. And I know some people are going to call that child abuse, but the point is that in society, there used to be a million voices that would say, here's what a boy is, here's what a girl is. Not always in appropriate ways, but it was very clear that there was actually a difference. And that voice is just gone from society. The Boy Scouts kind of played that role. Not only that there is such a thing called boys, but here's what boys should be. Here's who they should become. And, we've talked about how, even after the mass shootings this past year, Shane, how our culture is failing young men. And I don't think it's just in these kind of extreme acts of violence. I think it's in the deaths from despair. I think it's acts of desperation. This is something that's deeply on my heart and mind, that there's not very many institutional voices helping to identify for young men who they are. What does it mean to be a young man? Who has God made them to be? I'm grateful that Trail Life has stepped into that void. And because, look, the Boy Scouts are quickly losing that ground, and they've played that role in American society. And they become especially important in a place where the family is in decline, where the church is in decline, where the church largely doesn't speak to these issues maybe as loudly or as effectively as they should. This is a big loss for a society. If we don't grow young boys into young men, that's a task of society, and I mean the various institutions of society. And there's just not very many voices doing that. Speaking of young men, I do want to talk about a story too. And we mentioned earlier I was at the Live Action Gala. I just love the work that Live Action has been doing, educating America on social media. When life begins and the value of life, our friend Lila Rose there has just done terrific work, as well as the other young people that are on that team. It's just really stunning. By the way, there were 5 young women on the Live Action team that were pregnant. So they're proving that they're pro-life, including Lila, who was, I think, 6 weeks away from the birth of her little girl. If I remember correctly, I think that they found out that it's a little girl. So just really fun to be there. But one of the individuals that was there was David Daleiden, who used to work for Live Action. Of course, David Daleiden, known for his work exposing Planned Parenthood sale of baby body parts. One of the challenges of the scheduling of when you and I record is that if a story breaks on Friday, it's going to be another week before we can actually talk about it. Here, we're recording this early Friday morning. It's going to go on air later on and be live on the podcast later on today. But last Friday, David Daleiden, his court decision came down, and basically Planned Parenthood has sued him for damages for basically doing citizen investigative journalism. And a court found him guilty. This is a civil trial, and the fines now, we add it all up, I think we're talking about over $2 million. And it's just really stunning. Of course, this is in California. It's in San Francisco. But I bring that up because David, to me, is an example of somebody, somewhere along the line, he figured out what it is to be a young man, right? To protect the weak, to expose evil, and to do all of that stuff. But we live in a culture where that's not always valued.
Yeah, and if the flack he's caught for the last several years is any indication, John, he hit his target. I remember thinking back in 2015 when the Center for Medical Progress videos were coming out, And it was just the most, like, it was huge news. And I thought, this has got to be the end of Planned Parenthood. Nobody can justify this. Nobody can sit there and try to defend this and pretend it's okay. Not only were they caught on camera haggling over the price of baby body parts, something that's hardly in line with their official story that they were, donating scientific material and basically charging postage fees. But on top of that, Planned Parenthood executives and doctors were admitting on camera that they alter abortion procedures to get better tissue, which is also illegal, explicitly so. So I thought, this has got to be the end of them. Yet look who's been damaged most and dragged through the mud for the last 4 years in this court battle. It's been the messenger. It's been David Daleiden and his associates who exposed this behavior. I think that shows how committed, in many ways, almost at a religious level, our legal system and our entire powerful segment of our culture is to abortion. This is another one of those.
I want to jump in on that because it's clear that our culture is, and yet even then we have seen things that our culture has been committed to, that when stuff like this gets revealed, I'm with you. Look, those videos were so damning. It's like, where do you go from here? How can this not be dealt with? And I look at the number of things that have bounced off of Planned Parenthood, and it makes no sense to me how they weather these storms and still rise up as the good guy and still get federal funding, even from folks who promise to defund them. And I think, look, the only thing that explains this to me, if you don't believe in the demonic and the power of demonic strongholds, and look, you're hearing something from me that is outside of my theological comfort zone right now, but I don't get this. If you don't believe in demonic powers and demonic strongholds, I don't know how you make sense of Planned Parenthood's ability to deflect just unbelievable allegations and proof that they're an evil organization from top to bottom. I mean, historically, look, Margaret Sanger's words about black people would be enough to end almost any other organization in America, just that. Add to that financial improprieties, add to that the amount of taxpayer funding that they get, add to that legal things that they clearly violate, add to that Lila Rose's early videos before we get to David Daleiden's videos.
Yeah.
Look, I can't explain this other than demonic.
This is one of those moments when I think the best response may be to apply the logic consistently across the board to show how absurd it all is. You mentioned, citizen investigative journalism. There's a tradition of that sort of thing. David Daleiden is being brought down over his having gone undercover and gotten top Planned Parenthood execs to admit things on camera. But, if you think about it, there have been multiple sting operations in like the animal processing industry and the farming industry. If this had been an operation exposing like a factory cattle farm for cruel practices or a pig farm or something, everyone would be okay with it. No one would be going after the messenger. The farm would be shut down. If this was like SeaWorld showcasing some sort of abuse of animals, then there'd be no question of going after the investigator. And yet because it's human babies, because it's Planned Parenthood and this sacred cow on the left, it's the messenger we're going after, not the organization that's clearly done, egregious wrong.
So what's the lesson for all of us today? First of all, that these are times that call for courage. I think that is a theme that runs throughout this all the stories that we've talked about and the other handful of stories we didn't even get to. This is a time for courage. I think also we need to be in prayer for people that are in these cultural crosshairs. The pressure is enormous, and that includes for David Daleiden. Now, his case will be appealed. Will likely go to the Ninth Circuit, which I think is a different Ninth Circuit than it was just even 3 or 4 years ago, which means elections have consequences. We'll be watching that story and some others. Well, we're out of time for today. Been great to be with you. Thanks for joining us each and every week here on Breakpoint this week. If you do benefit from the sort of content that we provide here on this program and on our Breakpoint commentaries and on our website, we are a listener and reader-supported organization. Consider giving a year-end gift. We've got a terrific matching grant right now, so every dollar will be effectively doubled. You can find out more at breakpoint.org/give. That's breakpoint.org/give. For Shane Morris, I'm John Stonestreet. You've been listening to Breakpoint This Week.